When my wife, Emily, and I inherited the cabin from my late uncle, we saw it as a lucky break. A small vacation home tucked away in the woods, something we could fix up and maybe even rent out. My Uncle Richard had owned it for decades, but we had only been there a handful of times when I was a kid. The place had been occupied for years by a long-term tenant, an old man named Harold, who moved out shortly after Richard passed. The lawyer handling the estate said Harold left without much fuss, which seemed odd considering how long he'd lived there. But we didn't think too much about it at the time. The drive up was peaceful, the winding road cutting through dense forest before opening up to a small clearing where the cabin sat. From the outside, it looked exactly how I remembered, modest, a little run-down, but nothing we couldn't handle. The front porch sagged slightly, and the paint was peeling, but it had character. We had planned to spend the weekend cleaning, assessing what needed repairs, and getting a feel for the place before deciding what to do with it long-term. Neither of us expected it to feel so occupied. The first sign was the smell. Not the stale, musty air we expected from an empty house, but something lived in. Wood smoke, faint traces of cooking, the unmistakable scent of laundry detergent. Emily wrinkled her nose as we stepped inside. The living room was cluttered, but not in an abandoned way. Magazines and newspapers stacked on the coffee table, a throw blanket draped over the couch like someone had just been sitting there. It felt like whoever left had only stepped out for a moment. Then we found the kitchen. Dirty dishes in the sink, a half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter. The fridge was still running, humming softly, and when I opened it, I froze. Fresh food. Eggs, milk, even leftovers in Tupperware. None of it expired. Someone had been here recently. Emily looked over my shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Maybe Harold came back for something, she suggested. But it didn't make sense. Why would a man who moved out weeks ago still have fresh food in the fridge? We searched the rest of the house, and the unease only deepened. The bed in the master bedroom was unmade, but not abandoned, like someone had just rolled out of it that morning. A toothbrush sat by the bathroom sink, damp. Towels hung neatly on the rack. It wasn't just that someone had been here, it was that someone was still here. The worst part was the muddy footprints leading to the basement door. The door itself was locked, which was strange. Uncle Richard never mentioned a basement. We didn't even know there was one. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Emily was already on her phone, calling the locksmith. "If it's a squatter, we'll deal with it," she said. "We'll change the locks and get a security system installed. No big deal." She was trying to be logical, but I could hear the nervous edge in her voice. That night, I barely slept. The cabin was too quiet, every creak and groan of the old wood stretching into something sinister in my mind. Emily seemed calmer, but I could tell she was uneasy too. We had changed the locks, installed a basic security system with motion sensors, and double-checked every window before going to bed. It should have been enough to make us feel safe. But I kept thinking about the kitchen, the footprints, and the locked basement door. Someone had been living here, recently. Maybe even still. I woke up at dawn, my stomach in knots. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. Emily was still asleep, so I got up quietly and went to the kitchen, hoping coffee would settle my nerves. But when I stepped inside, my blood ran cold. The dishes were gone. The sink was empty. The countertops were clean. I opened the fridge, and my hands started shaking. It was fully stocked again, fresh eggs, milk, bread, even neatly wrapped leftovers that I knew hadn't been there yesterday. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't a squatter. Squatters don't clean. Squatters don't restock the fridge. Someone wasn't just staying here, they were taking care of the house. But why? And how did they get in when we had changed all the locks? My first thought was the basement. If there was another way in, it had to be down there. I grabbed the spare hammer from our toolkit and headed to the basement door. The new lock we installed was still intact, no signs of forced entry. I hesitated for a moment before slamming the hammer against the doorknob. It took a few hits, but eventually, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow wooden staircase leading down into darkness. A damp, earthy smell wafted up, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic. I fumbled for a light switch, but there wasn't one. My phone flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows as I descended, the steps groaning under my weight. The air was noticeably colder down here, and as I reached the bottom, I realized why. Against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a second door. Not just any door, a hidden one, flush with the stone foundation, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. My gut screamed at me to turn back, to leave this alone. But I had to know. I reached out and pressed against the door. It gave way too easily, swinging open into a small, windowless space. The first thing I saw was the bed. A simple cot with rumpled sheets, still warm like someone had just been lying there. Next to it, a small wooden table with a plate of half-eaten food, an old notebook, and a single, flickering candle. The walls were lined with shelves full of canned goods, neatly organized. Someone had been living down here. Someone who still was. And that's when I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps on the floorboards above me. I froze. The sound of footsteps above me sent a wave of cold panic through my body. Whoever had been staying here, whoever had been sneaking in, stocking the fridge, and cleaning the house, was still inside. I turned off my phone's flashlight and held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, not wandering aimlessly, but moving with purpose. Like someone knew I was down here. I wanted to run. I should have run. But something in me, some morbid need to see, kept me rooted in place. I slowly backed into the corner of the small room, pressing myself against the cold stone wall, my mind racing. Had they seen me come down? Had they been watching us the whole time? The idea that someone had been living under us, moving around when we weren't looking, made my skin crawl. Then the footsteps stopped, right above me, directly over the hidden room. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to keep my breathing silent. The floorboards creaked again, and then came the worst part, the sound of something dragging. A long, heavy scrape, like furniture being pushed across the floor. My brain screamed at me to move, but my body refused to listen. And then silence. For a long time, nothing. No more footsteps. No more sounds. Just the quiet hum of my own pulse in my ears. I waited, forcing myself to count in my head. 1 minute. 2. 3. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I crept toward the door and peered out into the basement. It was empty. The stairs were clear. I gripped the hammer tightly, forcing my legs to move, and started my way back up. When I reached the top, I hesitated before pushing the door open. The kitchen was empty. The house was still. But something was wrong. The air felt different, charged, expectant. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the room. Then my eyes landed on the dining table, and my stomach dropped. The chairs had been moved. Not just randomly shuffled around, but placed carefully. 4 of them, perfectly arranged around the table, except for one, which had been pulled out slightly, like someone had been sitting there, waiting. I turned to wake Emily, but she was already standing in the hallway, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her voice was shaking. I nodded slowly. And that's when we heard it, coming from inside the basement, the unmistakable sound of the door clicking shut. We didn't speak. We didn't move. We just stood there, staring at the basement door, now sealed shut. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was impossible. I had just come up. I had left it open. There was no way it could have closed by itself. Emily grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't argue. We grabbed our bags without packing properly, throwing whatever we could into the trunk. The whole time, I kept glancing at the basement door, half expecting it to open again for someone or something to step out. But nothing happened. The house remained eerily silent, like it was watching us. We sped away, gravel crunching under the tires as we left the cabin behind. I didn't let myself breathe until we hit the main road. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want one. The next day, we called a locksmith and a contractor, telling them to check the basement. They both swore the door was locked when they arrived. They found no hidden passage, no extra way in or out. The small room I had seen, it wasn't there, just a solid stone foundation. "There's no extra space down there," the contractor told me. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing shadows?" I knew what I had seen. The warm bed, the food, the candle, the footsteps. But there was no proof. Nothing to explain any of it. We never went back. The cabin sold within a few months, and I didn't care who bought it or what they found. But sometimes late at night, I still think about it. About the hidden room that shouldn't have existed. About the fridge restocking itself. And about the footsteps that stopped right above me. Like they knew I was there. Like they were listening.